I had sailed ashore in the Andaman mangroves in 1911 to finish a routine hydrographic survey. But what we came to call a mangrove shadow turned an ordinary charting party into something that none of us would ever treat as purely scientific again. The tide was low, the guides grew silent, and an unease gathered like fog among the aerial routes. I led a 5-man survey detachment of the Survey of India, our kit as familiar as a litany. A theodolite mounted upon its brass-tipped tripod, a plane table with sheets already scored in pencil and ink, a sextant and chronometer for fixing latitude and longitude, and a shallow draft steam launch to thread the creeks. We had lead lines for sounding, canvas tents for shelter, and salted provisions lashed in oilskin. Our orders were precise and prosaic. Chart the western mangrove channels, fix a safe channel for supply craft from Port Blair, and record timber stands for the colonial administration. The work was ordinary, the sea and the mud would make it hard, but not strange. We came ashore beneath a low sun that left the horizon a band of white. The steam launch hissed as we secured her to a prop route. The mud exhaled with each receding wave, soft, loamy, a smell of brine and new rot, and the air was thick with mosquitoes and a salt heat that settled into shirt and skin. I set the theodolite on a slightly raised hummock. Thornton, my assistant, unrolled the plane table and fixed the alidade. The chronometer lay cushioned in its box. Its steady tick was a small human comfort against the broad and indifferent tides. Our 2 guides, men from Port Blair who had threaded these creeks for years, moved with the sure silence of fishermen. They pointed out stands of rhizophora and bruguiera, knots of pneumatophores that rose like the teeth of some submerged thing. I made notes with the deliberate slowness a map requires. Angles, bearings, depths where the lead line fell to consistent sand. We sounded the main channel, the lead line, with its tallowed end, brought back the usual mixture of mud and shell, the tallow smeared with the scent of estuary life. At midday, the light lay flat across the water. It was then that Thornton, squinting along a narrow feeder channel, tightened his jaw and said nothing more. Our guides had stopped, staring across a tangle of roots and shadow where a side creek ran black as ink. The water there did not reflect the sky, it drank it. I walked forward, sextant tucked under my arm, plane table shut against damp, and noticed, as if it were a fault in the eye, the absence of birdsong. Egrets and terns, which had kept us company since dawn, had gone quiet. Shadow, one of the boatmen whispered, the English rough in his mouth. They used a word I did not comprehend then, and would only learn later, a cautious name. They would not step into that channel. They set down their poles as if casting a boundary. I took the lead line and cast it where the water blackened. The line went down with a soft fizzle and continued, deeper than it should have been for such an inlet. The tallow drew up clean, except for a thin smear of a substance like old peat. It had a faintly sweet, sour smell that settled in the back of the throat. My fingers felt the slickness, as if the thing had been applied by sea worms. I marked the depth and paced the bank. The theodolite's sighting showed a slight distortion in light across the rootwork, as if the air itself bent. We attempted a probing with a scull and a sounder, the little steam launch inches from the prop roots. The engine's steady throb felt, in that place, as disproportionate as a drummer in a cathedral. Twice the sculls struck a resistance beneath the surface and sprang back. The wake collapsed into silence. Once, as we stood shoulder to shoulder, I heard a long, wet rasp, no more than the drag of something through silt, and Thornton's hand closed upon my sleeve. That evening we made camp on a higher hummock, canvas pegged into yielding mud, the chronometer under my pillow. We ate from tin plates, and salted meat tasted of the sea and was too quiet in the mouth. The guides would not sleep. They sat smoking in the dark and watched the channel, their faces thrown into relief by the campfire. They traded low words I could not pass and pointed now and again to the black water. I scanned my instruments by lamplight, checking the theodolite level, the plane table's bearings, the sextant's horizon glass. The map would not account for the blackness. At 2 points during the night, a sound moved through the roots, not a footfall, but a dragging, as of a vast cloth drawn across mud. The dogs of the settlement howled far off, then silence fell thick and immediate. We did not sleep. Dawn would find us, compelled by duty and by a curiosity that was, even then, professional, returning to the channel to take another set of bearings. I set the chronometer by hand and recorded the time. The maps of that coast would be finished, one way or another, but I had the impression that we were no longer only surveying trees and tides. The guide's silence and the mud's hush were a ledger of something else, a presence measured in absence. We resolved to probe further at first light, instruments ready, and the mangrove shadow waiting like a question beneath the surface. On the third night of our survey, the tide came in with a white patience that turned the creek into a moving mirror. I had lashed the theodolite to the gunwale and kept the chronometer on my person. The planetable and chain were lashed in the stern, and the sextant lay in its velvet case beneath the tarpaulin. We were making soundings by lead line between great stanchions of rhizophora, taking bearings with the prismatic compass whenever an opening showed a patch of sky. The mosquitoes had made a shroud of every hour, and the men moved in slow, automatic gestures, coiling lines, wiping salt from instruments, trading small sips of tea towards sleeplessness. It was the Malays who first would not go farther. Pak Rahim and two of the fisherfolk had been steady hands upon many treks. Their faces held no superstition except that of long acquaintance with tide and reef. Yet that evening, their voices fell spare and sharp. "Not after dark," Rahim said, the word a shudder in his mouth. He would not ply the smaller channels, he would not take us beyond the low bank, where mud loosened into black water. They pointed to eddies, to patches in the water where the current ran wrong, and muttered of a thing that passed with the high water and left behind a smell of brine and something like old leaf mould. We took our bearings nonetheless. It is the wont of the surveyor to trust instruments where men are fearful. At dusk, we anchored within a fork of the creek to take a final meridian sight. The sextant rose and fell between spar and moon as I measured stellar depression for latitude. The night was close, the air tasted of iron and rot. Lantern glow painted the exposed roots the colour of bone. A sound came then, first mistaken for wind upon leaves, then certain. It was not the slap of a rat upon timber, nor the creak of oarlocks. It was low and dragged like a rope over stone, and it travelled with the flow of water as if the channel itself were breathing. For a moment, none of us spoke. The Malays stared down into the black. Rahim pointed, and his finger trembled. From the opposite bank there rose a shadow upon the water, not of driftwood, nor of any vessel we knew. It slid like ink beneath the reflected lamps, broad as the beam of our boat, and low, so low that the top of it kissed the mangrove buttresses as it passed. Its outline was ambiguous, now a bulk, now a suggestion of limbs, but there was the impression of length and of something that used the tide as one might use a road. Where it moved, the water closed with a small sucking sound. Bubbles rose and vanished, as if some great lung breathed under the surface. I will not claim to have seen eyes, for the light was poor and the mind quick to pattern. But I remember the way Rahim stepped backward with his hand upon his knife, and the way old Cartwright, my assistant, who had surveyed coasts from Labrador to Borneo, reached for the boat hook as if to repel a stray log. The thing brushed the stern. The shock threw us one of the fisherfolk lost his grip, and there was a cry. A moment later, a smeared darkness where he had stood widened and closed, and he was gone. We did not dally. Practice and peril made decisions clear. I cut the painter and ordered oars. We could not effect recovery in that morass, and at that tide the sound of the shadow moving along the truncation of roots had become a long, wet scraping. We rowed by compass, keeping the chronometer's hourly beat in my head and the sextant stowed against salt. For an hour, the creek pressed at us with every foreshortened current. The tide attempted to pin the keel between two roots, and we had to war with it, hauling with backs split and fingers raw. Cartwright cursed softly, then fell to a steady rhythm. The Malays rowed in silence, faces like pale shells. At first light, we reached open water and put up a sail. Two of our party tended the lost man's empty space and the wet stain upon the planks. We marked the spot upon the planetable as best we could, a pair of hasty coordinates and the words "avoid after dusk" scrawled in the margin. We made report at the settlement. The magistrate made notes and frowned at my instruments, then dismissed the tale with the polite incredulity of the accustomed. The Malay men would not return to those creeks. Rahim took his wages and left for his village, and would speak of nothing but the colour of the tide the day his companion disappeared. I filed the charts and the chronicle. Some months later, when I examined the stencil of our tracks, I found the ink smudged in the margin where the planetable had been dampened by spray, an obscuration the clerk called merely bad handling. To me, it still reads, antiseptic though it is, a blot upon the mapped world where a shadow moved with the water and took a man. The Admiralty paid my expenses. They offered no further expedition. The maps of that bend now bear a penciled caution, and the local fishermen place leaves at their bow gates for luck. I have returned seldom to those creeks. The memory remains, the smell of brine and old leaf mould, the sound like rope on stone, and the way the instruments sat steady upon the gunwales while the world about them slid darkly by. I kept the sextant, and the chronometer I keep the page of the planetable folded and unread. The mystery endures in the mouths of the Malay men, and in an officer's note that will not be found upon our neat Admiralty charts, that at tide the mangrove country gave up one of its own to something that crossed the creeks with the water, and that in that country some shadows are not the absence of light, but the presence of something very old. Our planetable sketches first showed the anomaly. Long parallel depressions in the mud, too wide for any known keel and crisscrossed by stripped bark where mangrove roots had been scraped clean. I wrote the lines in ink with the alidade before the tide obscured them, noting angles with the prismatic compass and making a separate entry of the curious marks beside the soundings taken with the lead and line. That afternoon, a Gunter's chain had snapped in two. Where we intended to take a baseline, the halves lay upon the mud like two divided truths. We measured again, by eye and paces, and each time the figures refused to reconcile with the physical evidence. By night, the camp had the ordinary inconveniences of an August tide: swarming mosquitoes, a tang of brackish decay, and the never-absent damp that turns leather and paper brittle at the same time. We rigged the lamps, hurricane glass and tallow tins, and set a double watch. Mr. Thomas, my chief chainman, and Ellis of the Royal Engineers took the first turn upon the jetty Rahman, who carried our instruments and served as interpreter with the local fishermen, remained with the spare anchors and the box of pegs. I slept in the ground sheet behind the planetable, awake at intervals to prove to myself that the strange things had been recorded and not dreamed. Shortly after midnight, they roused me. From the lamp's pool on the piling, we could see where something had been rubbing its bulk against the timbers. The bark lay stripped in a long ribbon. The timber's face showed a satin polish, as if a gloved hand had worked along it again and again. There was the hollow, thudding sound as of a very heavy body moving waterward, softly, intermittently, each impact lost to the sucking mud. I could feel the vibration through the soles of my boots. We took our arms and went out upon the jetty. The night was moonless. The only light came from the lamps and a sky of extinguished stars. We followed the rub marks along the piles and found, leading from the jetty into the flats, the same parallel depressions my sketches had shown. They ran in a straight, unerring line for 30 yards before the tide had covered them, each furrow broad as a man's shoulder. Between them, the mud had been flayed to a smoothness that no tide could account for, where saplings had once clung. Roots were torn and exposed, as if grasped and peeled. We examined the snapped chain. The fracture was clean, and the links bent outward, as if something had taken the chain in its jaws and twigged it in a single, deliberate motion. There were particles upon the broken links, fine black sand, and a pale, fibrous residue that smelled of brine, and something else I did not name. Rahman touched it with the tip of a finger and drew back. He had the look of a man who had seen the earth within the grip of other hands. We tried to track the impressions ashore the following morning when the tide lay out and exposed more of the flat. At low water, the trail led not to a boat or to ordinary creatures, but toward a shallow channel where the mangroves crowded thick and the ground gave a sucking complaint beneath every step. The gouges continued beneath the shadow of the roots, and there the bark scraping broadened into a kind of deliberate clearance, a corridor of stripped clay and snapped seedling trunks, as if an enormous thing had forced its way through the living wall. Men muttered equipment was checked again with the clinical steadiness that the army teaches. We measured the widths, photographed nothing for there were no cameras with us, but made exact ink notes on the planetable. I ordered that no man go alone. We set a line of pegs and a bayonet at every station and left a marker of red cloth on the last exposed route as a reference for the next tide. Ellis suggested we bring firearms to bear if compelled. I authorized the Enfield and 2 pistols, though I confess we carried them more for the comfort of being able to respond than for the hope of shooting at whatever made those marks. That evening, the noises returned, with a new certainty. The rubbing came from the direction of the cleared corridor, closer now, and with each low thud, the boards of the jetty shivered as if something solid had bumped and then drawn itself along the piles. One of the men reported a smell, not of rot, but of deep, wet fur or oil, something that put the taste of copper upon the tongue. We blew the lamps upon a trial and waited at the ready. The tide rose and swallowed half the track. The last thing I saw before sleep carried me was the planetable under a low spread of matting, our inked lines like a map drawn to a thing that did not answer. We meant the next day to follow the corridor into the mangrove and to bring back some decisive explanation. Driftwood scoured by the tide, an overgrown scow, the roots cleared by men. Yet in the morning the corridor had been altered, as though something had passed through it after dark and gone farther inland. The pegs we had left were bent, the red cloth torn, and where the mud had been firm, the footprints of more than one man were absent. I resolved then, in the careful hand of a surveyor, that we would not be cursory any longer. We prepared lines and extra ropes, packed the sounding lead and the spare chain, and readied ourselves to follow the trail where it vanished into the shadow of the mangroves. On an hour of falling light, we watched a shape move between the prop roots. No clear outline of limb or head, only an immense, low-slung silhouette that filled the channel and shifted like a darker tide. It came slow, scraping the stilted roots as though testing them for rot, and our launch rocked in the wash of its passage. The smell of brine and old vegetation rose off it, peat and sea salt, and the sour of drowned leaves. And beneath the scent there was a sound like a great log being dragged along a mud bank. I remember how the men went white. Lieutenant Harrow's hand left the wheel. Bennett fumbled the steam throttle until the engine hiccuped and sobbed. The theodolite trembled on its tripod, the prism catching the last light and throwing a thin bar of fire across the water as the thing, always nearer, extended itself and tested the light with slow, patient movements. We had laid out a chain of triangulation points that afternoon, set the chronometer, run fixed bearings by sextant, and now all that precision looked contemptibly small against the weight in the channel. We judged our position by chart and by sound of tide. The survey book shows entries for 6th of January 1907. Western fringe of South Andaman, channel between Garachama and solitary Mangrove Islet. Spring ebb, light breeze SE. We had with us a pocket compass, lid line, tins of preserved beef and plum jam, 3 jerry cans of fresh water, and theodolite number 12. An instrument I had trusted more than men in squalls. The launch rode high on an ebb we had measured the mangrove roots, rose like a cathedral of ribs from the ooze, and through them the shadow moved as if the mud itself had muscled. Harrow ordered us to back the launch, carefully to avoid grounding. We eased astern until the stern bumped a root, and a vibration ran along the hull like a prayer. That vibration became a pressure, then a grinding. Something heavy rubbed against the planks, and dragged an oarlock jumped free and snapped. Ramu, our best boatman, who knew channels by smell and could read a tide as a pilot reads a chart, swore softly and went to the afterskiff to try a sounding. He preferred a hand lead in those narrow mangrove drains. A deep-sounding line is the only honest companion. When Ramu leaned, the shadow turned. It did not flee. Instead, it settled, pressing the water away and making the roots bloom with white foam where its presence disturbed the mud. For a long moment, nothing more happened, only the slow breathing of the launch's boiler and the creak of the tripod in the salt air. Then the skiff's oars clattered as if struck, and the afterskiff listed. I sprang to assist. Raymer's voice called once, sharp, and then there was a rip, and the world filled with the smell of fresh earth and something colder than the evening. We gave way. I cannot describe the exact manner of that surrender. It was a practical thing. The tide favored one course only if we could keep our hull free of the roots. We slackened steam wholly and cut our forward hawser, leaving the theodolite and its silk-lined box on the quarterdeck, while two of us pushed with boat hooks and the rest stood ready with spare tackles. The mangrove shadow rubbed the launch as a hand might an old friend. Its movement was not blind, it sought, it tested, it acknowledged. We got free with a night broken into by coughs and swallowed curses. In the confusion, theodolite number 12 toppled from its tripod and cracked. Its limb was bared and useless. More grievous, Ramu was gone. We scoured the roots by lantern light for hours. Bennett's hands bled on mangrove bark as he clambered, and Harrow took the lead line until it tore from his grip. At dawn, there were no prints, no blood, only the wide gouge on the inner root where the shadow had brushed the bark and a smear of mud where a man's sleeve might have been. The official log, when I composed it later in the cabin of the survey vessel, is as tidy as paper allows. Minor mishap to auxiliary launch, instrument damaged, one member of crew missing, search undertaken. Local currents and entangling roots, the probable cause of accident. That is the sort of sentence fitted to Admiralty consumption, neat, circumspect, and cold. Nor did I find it possible to reconcile that leisurely tone with what I had smelt and heard. The men who remained would later avoid that channel. Harrow refused to lead another survey on the western fringe. Bennett's sleep grew thin and stared. The chronometer kept time as usual. The sea chart bears now a penciled cross where we lost the theodolite and the line notes C marginalia. Local fishermen muttered of a mangrove shadow and, when pressed, would fall silent or change the subject. I filed my formal report, but I kept a faint memorandum in the margins of my private journal, an untechnical note of a thing that moved like a darker tide and smelled of brine and old vegetation. We continued the survey in other channels, and the maps were completed. Still, an expanse of mangrove on the western chart remained marked with a small, stubborn space of caution. Years afterward, whenever a sailor asked me of the Andamans, I found my hand go to that margin, and I would say only that once, at an hour of falling light, something else had coursed the roots. The loss, the cracked theodolite, the empty place at table, the carved root remained. The mangrove shadow stayed unentered upon any naturalist's register, and the question of what moved there between prop roots has outlived the men who saw it. We ran the launch on the rising tide and left some instruments and a section of chain behind. The memory of how we behaved in those last minutes is better kept in the body than in any single sentence. The heat of exertion, the scrape of oars on mudflats, the snapping of wet rope as I lashed gear that would not be taken aboard in time. The Planetable, its brass fittings dulled with salt, had been set upon a flat of exposed root to take a bearing. The chain rode out from the stern and into the channel to hold position for our sounding. The Malay guides would not return to that creek. Our official field notebook afterwards contained a terse entry, signed by every man, that simply read, "Unidentified mangrove shadow observed at low water." It was not immediate terror that sent us off, but a series of concrete observations mounting in the space of an hour. At half ebb, the exposed mud lay like black cloth, studded with mangrove stumps and the hollowed shells of oysters. A smell rose from it, ancient mud, decaying leaf mold, and something fouler, a sulphurous tang that made throats tighten. The shadow lay along the deepest gouge of the creek, a compaction of shade under the prop roots. At first, we thought it merely an eddy or a deposit of silt until it shifted. The movement was deliberate and large. Where the shallows thinned and the tide threaded its way, the dark mass withdrew and reformed, as if some submerged limb had passed beneath, drawing with it the eddies. There was a scrape against the chain, a sound not unlike a heavy keel running over barnacled timber. The chronometer on my chest ticked, as if to confirm that the world continued its ordinary courses, and yet the tide itself seemed to carry a new attentiveness, as when the sea takes note of a thing foreign to its habit. We did what surveyors do under stress. We measured, we recorded, we tested hypotheses. One man, steady of hand, sent his sounding lead at the margin of the shadow. The line ran down and slackened as if the lead had struck a yielding belly. The lead did not return clean when it came up. The plummet was fouled with a strip of fibrous matter that smelled of brine and rotted leaf, and a portion of the chain that had been fixed for a previous measurement was straining away as if some great thing below had taken hold and run with it. We hauled, shouted, lashed, every small ritual meant to master an indifferent landscape. A low sound came from the mangroves then, not the chittering of birds, nor the call of a monkey, but a hollow, sluicing noise that set the men still. A Malay guide, who had been attentive to wind and current all day, untied his bundle without a word and stepped back from the route line. His eyes had the look of a man who had seen a bad omen. He refused our insistence that he point the place for later notes. "Not here," he said in Malay, and would not be swayed. As the tide rose about our transom, we were forced to make a pragmatic choice. The chronometer and the planetable might be replaced. A lost chain could be bought in Calcutta. A bruised body could be mended. There are limits to what a party of surveyors may bargain for alone. We shoved off, the launch shuddering over mussel banks, and in that haste left a sextant case, the sounding lead's spare reel, and some 30 fathoms of chain coiled upon the roots. We reached the schooner with hollow lungs, and hands blistered to the quick. Nobody laughed, and no one spoke of bravado. That night, each man wrote in his own hand the same 4 words in the official field notebook, and beneath that terse line, every signature was set, a catalogue of witnesses. The next morning, the charting officer penciled, with a hand that trembled perhaps from the heat, a small warning by the channel on the map. From then on, the shore was avoided by the shore parties, postings circled it wider. The Malay guides refused to be seconded to that creek, and tales of the dark place passed among the crews as one might pass an unclean object. We have returned to that part of the river since only by other channels, and I have lived long enough to see the 1911 survey drawn and redrawn. The penciled mark, the terse entry, the men's signatures, that modest archive is all the proof we have beyond our own recollection. The instruments we left lie still beneath root and tide, where perhaps the mangrove shadow keeps its counsel. The question of what made that shadow remains with us, not answered, but conserved as a quiet nuisance upon a map and as a thing that altered a small course of men who thought themselves practiced at reading the world's inclinations.